Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Liz Martin, the Managing Director and General Manager for Global Defense at Amazon Web Services, about the company's work in the national security space with cloud services and generative AI, cooperation versus competition inside the defense industry, and much more. And then we break down the possibility of major U.S. strikes on Iran, the Pentagon's escalating feud with Anthropic, and China's secret underground nuclear test. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. I am back in the Northeast after a couple days in sunny South Florida at the Defense Tech Leadership Summit, which I'll talk more about later in the show, and have an exclusive interview from that summit with Liz Martin, the Managing Director and General Manager for Global Defense at Amazon Web Services. So stay tuned for that coming up in just a couple of minutes. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always here, what's on your radar this week?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be back here with you for another episode. The big thing that I'm tracking is whether or not President Trump is going to authorize some kind of military strikes against Iran. Speculation about this is huge right now in the U.S. intelligence community, at the Pentagon, and really across the U.S. national security community. Trump is obviously keenly aware of that, and he's riding it publicly, really drawing attention to it. In the hours before we taped this week's episode, the president made global headlines by announcing that if no diplomatic deal is reached quickly with Iran on its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and other factors like Tehran's ongoing support for militant proxies around the Middle East, then Trump said he's willing to escalate things by ordering military strikes on Iran. Specifically, Trump said he'll make a decision over the next 10 days on whether or not to take military action. So we should know by March 1 whether the U.S. Is going to bomb Iran. It's interesting that Trump made this statement just days after what seemed to be the most successful direct diplomatic meeting between U.S. officials and Iranian officials in years. There were talks on February 17 in Geneva, Switzerland, Ben. After those talks, Iran's foreign minister actually said that, quote, a path for a deal has started, end quote. That was kind of a breakthrough comment. The problem is that it was completely overshadowed by aggressive moves that Iran's military made on February 17, just as Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoys, were sitting down to talk with the Iranians in Geneva. Basically, Iran carried out a major live fire missile exercise in the Strait of Hormuz, essentially closing key parts of that strategic Mideast oil shipping choke point for hours in a show of force. Also, Ben, just before the February 17 talks, Iran's supreme religious leader gave a speech in which he threatened that Iranian missiles are capable of destroying U.S. aircraft carriers that Trump has sent to the region in recent weeks. So despite the prospect of a little diplomatic breakthrough, the military tensions are actually soaring. And for those of us who've covered high-stakes U.S.-Iran tensions and negotiations for years, decades in my case, there's a kind of cat and mouse thing going on here. I like to call it brinkmanship diplomacy. It's what the Iranians specialize in, and it's what Trump himself has now become something of a master of. At least I'm sure he probably thinks that. You know, Trump has been working on this for a long time. Remember way back in 2017 when U.S. tensions with North Korea were at a high point, And Trump famously said if North Korea didn't knock off its nuclear testing, it would be met with, quote, fire and fury like the world has never seen. That was essentially a nuclear bomb threat against the Kim regime in Pyongyang. What followed were two direct summits between Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong un. Here's the catch, Ben. Did anything ultimately come of those summits? The reality is that they ended without any major agreement to denuclearize North Korea. And today, the Trump administration is stuck accepting that North Korea is the newest member of the Club of Nuclear Armed Nations. So, if we look at Iran, I'd say the Iranians took a lesson from that, Ben. They're thinking, let's call Trump on his bluff, and eventually we'll be a nuclear armed nation. But I also would say that Trump and his advisors are weighing the lesson as well, as we're going to be watching very closely in the Threat Status newsletter over the coming days, whether Trump orders some kind of an attack on Iran or not, perhaps a decapitation strike like the one that removed Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro from power in early January.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask, Guy. What indications you're hearing, we're hearing from sources at Threat Status about what the ultimate goals might be of any U.S. military action. Is it flat out regime change of some kind in Tehran, or is it just more targeted strikes to put more pressure on Iran diplomatically at the negotiating table to actually make a deal?
It's speculation. I don't know what more targeted strikes would look like. In June of last year, Israeli and U.S. military warplanes pounded Iranian underground nuclear sites. So, is there an intelligence assessment here that there's new activity at those sites and that there's a desire to pound them into the ground and prevent Iran from rebuilding those sites? Or are we talking about some kind of decapitation action that's designed to promote a regime change, building on the protests that we've seen that the regime so violently crushed last month? We don't know what the end goal is, and I think that's the responsibility of the administration. There's this delicate balance between not wanting to foreshadow or give away ahead of time what your actual military action is going to be, and then actually having a stated strategy. What's the goal? What ultimately is the U.S. trying to achieve in Iran? And I think the onus is on the Trump administration to explain that.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll see that. I think, the clock, as you mentioned, seems to be ticking by Trump's own estimation here, the 10-day mark. So we'll see if something comes before, during, or after that point when we reach it. So I mentioned at the outset, I was in Florida, West Palm Beach, to be specific, for the inaugural Defense Tech Leadership Summit, organized and sponsored by AWS, Amazon Web Services, Vanderbilt University, and Related Ross, which is the real estate company founded by billionaire Stephen Ross, who owns the Miami Dolphins, among other things. It was a relatively small event compared to other conferences that Guy and I have gone to recently, but it was important, I think, for a number of reasons, including that there seems to be a shift happening right now before our eyes of some major defense or defense-related tech, national security companies, infrastructure moving into South Florida. Just this week, while I was at the conference, Palantir said that it was relocating its headquarters from Denver to Miami, which is, of course, in South Florida. Other companies have done the same, and there was a real energy when I was there that you could almost feel in the air that the region, was becoming something of a defense tech industrial hub. It reminded me, Guy, in some ways of, the vibe, if you will, that you felt in Austin, Texas, a decade ago, which eventually led to, among other things, the founding of Army Futures Command in Austin in 2018. So sometimes there is this sort of coming together of academia, public officials, defense companies, tech companies, and frankly, really, really rich people like Stephen Ross that can pretty quickly transform a city or a region into something of an epicenter for defense tech businesses, research and development, and thought leadership. That seems to be happening in South Florida, but it is worth pointing out that I think a big part of the reason why is, of course, that Mar-a-Lago is in South Florida and is now a major hub of political, social, and economic power in the United States because Donald Trump is the president. So I'll be curious to see whether this emergence of South Florida is lasting and continues once Trump is out of office, or if it just sort of shifts to somewhere else in the country, wherever the next political center of power might be. But outside of that, there was no shortage of news from the conference, including comments from the stage by Emil Michael, the Pentagon's Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering, who said, during a fireside chat that it's disheartening, quote unquote, that some companies seem reluctant to fully do business with the military and basically allow their products to be used however the military sees fit. He didn't mention them by name, but he was referring to Anthropic, which is the Silicon Valley company behind the popular Claude AI tool. This story is really fascinating to me and is such a window into the kinds of disputes and complex issues that I think are going to become common as commercial companies in the Pentagon become even more intertwined in the 21st century. For listeners who may not have been tracking this, Anthropic is objecting, reportedly, to the fact that the U.S. military used Claude AI leading up to and during the Special Forces raid that captured then Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro last month. Anthropic has $200 million in contracts with DoD, but the company's guidelines essentially prohibit their products from being used to, quote, facilitate violence, develop weapons, or conduct surveillance, unquote. In other words, Anthropic doesn't want Claude to help U.S. drones identify targets and carry out airstrikes, for example. Defense Secretary Hegseth has threatened to cut all Pentagon ties with Anthropic as a result, and even limit the ability of other companies to work with Anthropic if they want government contracts. That's a big deal. Now, we should note this isn't unprecedented, of course. Emil Michael referred back to 2018 protests from thousands of Google employees about their use of the company's tech in Project Maven, a Pentagon initiative that wanted to use AI and machine learning to improve drone targeting. So not unprecedented, but it is worth keeping in mind here. I think this is sort of the natural result of this administration's approach to all of this stuff. Look, Army CTO Dr. Alex Miller just last week on this show said they want to use commercial solutions whenever possible. Defense Secretary Hegseth has made that perfectly clear time and time again. That's different than the government contracting out the development of a fighter jet, for example, and then the military owns it and can go bomb whatever it wants to with that jet. This is different. If you're signing a deal to use a company's tech, you don't necessarily own it. So how do the two sides figure out what's acceptable in terms of use for how it's used? There apparently are a lot of moral considerations that folks at Google almost a decade ago gave voice to, and now it seems like Anthropic is kind of picking up that baton, if you will. So I don't know, but I think listeners of this show know that both of us believe that this interplay between the government, specifically the Pentagon, Intel, and national security agencies, and private industry, especially in the tech space, is probably going to be one of the defining stories, really, of the next decade and probably even longer.
Interesting, Ben. It reminds me, one of the things I noticed when I was over at the Pentagon a few weeks ago, doing our threat status exclusive interview with Space Force Commanding General Chance Saltzman, was that there are these Uncle Sam wants you posters all over the Pentagon depicting Pete Hegseth as Uncle Sam, pointing his finger to personnel walking by. And the posters say, I want you to use AI today. That just indicates to me that there's this major push inside the Pentagon for personnel at all levels to experiment with and play with different AI platforms.
And we are joined now by Liz Martin, Managing Director and General Manager for Global Defense at Amazon Web Services. We're speaking here at the inaugural Defense Tech Leadership Summit in West Palm Beach, Florida. So I first need to thank AWS and everyone else involved with the summit for getting me out of the cold Northeast for a couple of days and down here to Florida. Liz, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben.
So just today, you all at AWS announced the Warfighter Capability Accelerator Initiative and the AWS Genesis Accelerator Initiatives, each of which, as I understand it, will provide $50 million in AWS credits over 3 years to help federal agencies and other organizations develop and deploy advanced capabilities using AWS cloud services and generative AI. That's a lot of words. What exactly does this mean in sort of layman's terms for our listeners? What are AWS credits and what's this entire initiative about?
Sure, we're really excited about this initiative today that we've announced. It is really meant to get after speed. There has been a lot of discussion here today at the summit around speed and acceleration. And the idea is that traditional defense acquisition cycles really are measured in years, sometimes decades. And the challenge is that the threat isn't waiting, and being able to deliver capabilities much faster into the hands of warfighters is really important. So we were thinking about how do we accomplish this and sort of get through that innovation valley and that gap between promising technology through demonstrations and actually delivering operational capability. So in order to compress that timeline, this initiative is what we have brought to bear. So the Warfighter Capability Accelerator that you mentioned there is $50 million of credits over the next 3 years for the Department of War, its partners, to remove some of those financial barriers to going quickly at getting past a pilot and into operational capabilities. So thinking about speed and the need for that to get to the AI leadership initiatives that are very much focused right now within the administration and within the Department of War. This is also advancing further the $50 billion investment that we just announced last November to build and deploy our first ever AI and high performance computing purpose-built infrastructure for the US government. So we're thinking about both of those programs as ways in which we make investments to move fast for the department.
This idea of speed, I've become kind of fascinated by that because I've heard that from just about every speaker I think on stage today so far at this Defense Tech Leadership Summit. I mean the idea of speed with today's pace of technological growth. I understand why it's important from a policy perspective. I'm curious of how difficult it is for a large organization, whether you're talking about the Department of War or a company like AWS. Can you move quickly enough, as quickly as we need to today? What challenges does that present for you?
We can, and moving from an innovation capability into a production capability requires a fair amount of diligence. It requires, security is job zero for us, and it requires a variety of purposefulness that if we have the focus and we have the purposefulness around it, we can get after that speed challenge pretty quickly.
Competition and cooperation are words that I've also heard a number of times today and hear a lot in my reporting. I'm curious what that looks like today, given the scope of some of these projects that are kind of on the table. The Golden Dome is something that we at Threat Status have been covering a lot. We held a Golden Dome event last year and had representatives from a number of different companies on stage talking about it because, as you know, they all have to work together to make something that complex a reality. Is competition versus cooperation between companies, AWS and other competitors, rivals, cooperators, wherever you want to describe them, what does that look like today, and has it changed over the past few years?
I do think it has changed over the past few years. The concept of large mega programs like Golden Dome from America that you just mentioned are really systems of systems, the way the government is thinking about them. And, that takes a portfolio of capabilities to deliver those systems of systems, which means, cooperation needs to happen between different capability providers to work together to deliver those systems of systems. So thinking about utilizing existing capabilities networked together, which is how Golden Dome for America is going to be realized soonest, and then evolving into future technologies and potential international partners. But programs like Golden Dome, they require a secure, resilient, scalable cloud infrastructure in order to support that whole complex multi-domain architecture. But the capabilities that ride atop of it have to be sourced across all sorts of excellence in the community. So we think about that as a cooperative partnership engagement with other members of industry to get after really significant programmatic capabilities.
Yeah, I was going to drill down on that for a second. So this idea, like obviously, you all at AWS and any number of these companies have proprietary technology in your own sort of products that theoretically you don't want to rival necessarily to have access to all. So where's the balance between that, this open architecture, we're getting the right to repair, all that good stuff. How do you look at that when you're talking about a system like Golden Dome?
Really, the way we look at that is our capabilities are leveraged by other capability providers.
Okay.
So folks that are producing programmatic capabilities, delivering specific outcomes for the department, are building those things atop the AWS resilient, secure infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so it's not a either or two different stovepipes, rather like a layered approach.
Yeah, you're part of the foundation.
We're part of the
essentially.
foundation, exactly.
Yeah. I'm curious, and I've asked this to a number of folks, both inside and outside government, and that's a question of whether the military is, and this can sound a little bit flippant sometimes, but too reliant on things like cloud and internet access. I've talked to some folks in industry who are trying to build what they call compartmentalized solutions, an AI assistant, for example, that can run without any connection to the internet or outside connectivity really at all, just on a device. Where's the sort of the balance between that? Where is it smart to look for compartmentalized solutions that don't need cloud access, don't need the internet, don't need anything, versus having sort of this broader architecture of connectivity to the cloud, which theoretically, as you well know, could become a target for an adversary in a future war?
I think it's not an either or, but an and.
Okay.
Because there are a variety of different operating modes that the Department of War needs to operate in. And therefore, they need a variety of different capabilities that will give them that optionality. So I think it's an and how we approach that is enabling edge to cloud capabilities so that the edge can operate disconnected and autonomously at the edge without cloud capability. And then when you have connectivity available and necessary again, you can connect back into the cloud and you can, process at the large scale that the cloud will offer you. At the edge, you're limited by what you can really accomplish, just the footprint of what's available to you in a potentially very constrained environment. And so having the or option at the edge is really important for customers to be able to pivot as their mission might change.
Yeah.
That they can be flexible in the moment.
Well, the flexibility seems key to me, is that we don't know what situations we're going to encounter in the future. We didn't know that there was going to be a raid in Caracas to bring home the then president of Venezuela, for example. So how do you, when we're having this conversation about how much connectivity you need at the edge, we can't necessarily envision the scenario, what the edge is going to look like in those scenarios. So how hard is it to kind of imagine all of that, I guess, if you will?
It's not that hard to imagine it. We work really closely with a number of our partners that operate almost predominantly at the edge, and thinking through the variety of use cases that they are solving for gives us that sort of portfolio of options of what that might look like. Is there something that needs to operate like always disconnected? Is there something that needs to operate minimally disconnected? Is there something that will usually be connected, but we need to plan for a bad moment when it's disconnected?
Right.
And solving for those and planning for them in advance is, I think, what's important, as opposed to reacting to them when they occur.
Yeah.
And so those are the types of conversations we've been having with a number of partners that really are operating at the tactical edge.
This is a really simple question, but I think you're in a good position to answer it, because we talk about a lot about artificial intelligence and machine learning on this show, and I think rightfully so, given their prevalence, and increasingly so in national security. But I think maybe too often we don't give enough kind of firm, tangible, concrete examples. What does that actually mean? How does it translate to like sort of nuts and bolts stuff that's going on today inside defense and national security spaces? Can you give us some examples of how they're actually used on a day-to-day basis now today?
I can. So AI and machine learning, they're being deployed across the entire mission lifecycle for defense and national security. So from planning through execution to post-mission analysis. Let me give you a few examples. So if you think about that mission lifecycle, pre-deployment, AI might optimize your mission planning, integrate real-time environment data, do some diagnostics and calibrating your sensors before you even, embark on what your mission might be. During the operation, we talked about edge, right? So doing some AI at the edge, whether that's autonomous navigation of unmanned aerial systems, whether that's fusing data from multiple sensors within a mission in real time, and then adapting to any threats as they emerge during the mission, all without needing to sort of constantly connect is important at the edge. And then mission execution, so identifying and recognizing and tracking what you're doing during a mission, if that's enabling multi-vehicle coordination or processing sensor data. And then when the mission is over, this is the part we want to make sure people don't forget, is actually reviewing the performance of the mission and the data so that you can train and build and improve for the next time, because that's the piece where we don't want the data to disappear after the mission. We want to be able to collect it and train for the next.
That's what I was going to ask, is what kind of processes are in place to sort of, an after action report, if you will, of here's what AI actually did for us, here's the time we saved, maybe here's the lives that we saved or the equipment that wasn't damaged because we used this AI or ML tool.
That is the most overlooked portion of the mission, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That is the piece where we see the data that isn't being collected long-term outside of the start and end bounds of the mission. There's so much information that the department could be capturing and learning from in those scenarios. That's probably the most overlooked portion of the mission with AI specifically. So let me give you an example, because you said, tell me about a specific example, Liz. I talked about, some of the use cases that we see of interest, but the U.S. Navy submarine maintenance. They are leveraging a multimodal agentic AI solution at Impact Level 5, which is the Department of War's highest security level for unclassified critical data. Mm-hmm. And by including AI into their processing and their workload, they reduce the process from weeks to hours of navigating hundreds of documents for maintenance work specifically. So if you think about how costly it is to have a submarine, for example, undergoing maintenance and not ready mm-hmm. and out in the mission space, reducing that time under maintenance is sizably important. Right. And so going from weeks to hours by leveraging AI is very critical for the Navy, and one of their first generative AI deployments for this type of work.
To finish up here, Liz, I want to ask about AWS and its role in, obviously you're involved in a lot of different things, but specifically drones and counter-drone capabilities. I know you all have something called the Maverick that's parked outside here, but I keep hearing people talk about, so maybe you can kind of tell our listeners here in a podcast version exactly what that is without them being able to see it. But how are you all involved in that space, and what are you learning as you go along in it?
Sure, absolutely. So the Maverick, which is a platform to sort of demonstrate this idea of a mobile innovation lab, if I could paint that picture for our listeners, is we recognize that our customers are doing work in the field, literally in the field. And so what we've done is we have created a mobile innovation capability that can be moved out into the field in whatever type of vehicle is necessary within the mission. We happen to have created a lovely vehicle with a nice AWS logo on the side of it, but the purpose of this is to demonstrate, for the example of a conversational drone control, right? So natural language control through our Amazon Bedrock, enabled by this mobile lab that will then, in conjunction with some of our partners like Anduril and Gambit, do a drone exercise. So for example, you could say, an operator could simply say, search the northeast quadrant. Natural language, it will deploy these drones out into a mapped area, and it will search and provide information back to the operator as to what these UAS have found. Makes it much simpler for the lay person at the edge to not have to code, not have to program anything, but to use natural language to interact with autonomous systems in the field. And so that is something we're really excited about, and it helps to really make things tangible for our customers as they're looking to leverage more and more autonomous systems in the field.
Next year, I'll have to bring our threat status video team down here with me so we can get some footage of the Maverick, because it is pretty cool to see. But thank you for that description. Liz Martin, the Managing Director and General Manager for Global Defense at Amazon Web Services. Thanks so much. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Ben.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all listen to the show. Guy, what do you have as your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that Russia's war in Ukraine will continue well beyond the February 24 fourth anniversary of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The latest round of U.S. brokered talks between Ukrainian and Russian officials essentially went nowhere, with division remaining deep over the future of land in eastern Ukraine that is occupied by the Russian army and that Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to keep. My threat is also that the invasion anniversary will be overshadowed by U.S.-Iran tensions and that the world has grown weary of hearing about Ukraine, even as the Kyiv Post newspaper reports that civilians living in the freezing Ukrainian capital now have just 4 to 6 hours of electricity per day following weeks of Russian bombing of the country's civilian power grid.
Yeah, that's not easy to listen to some of that when you hear details coming out over there. And you're right, it's sometimes I think it slips from top of mind and it shouldn't. My threat of the week is nuclear testing, especially in the aftermath of the death of the New START arms control treaty, which we talked about at length with John Seward last week here on the show and have been covering in depth in the Threat Status newsletter for weeks now. But this week it's back in the news because of public comments from a key State Department official who disclosed some new details about an alleged Chinese underground nuclear test back in 2020 that apparently, according to the U.S., was detected by seismic monitoring in Kazakhstan and registered a 2.75 magnitude on the seismic scale. Now, China, of course, denies that this underground blast took place, and Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov just this week said that neither Russia nor China has conducted nuclear tests. That's important, of course, because President Trump has said the U.S. will resume nuclear testing because those adversaries are also doing it. So whether or not this Chinese test actually took place is really important. And I think more broadly, the administration seems to be moving to a place where perhaps it's willing to reveal some more information, some more sensitive information publicly about alleged nuclear tests, perhaps by involving Russia and maybe even China as well. So we'll see where this goes, but it's my threat of the week because no matter how you slice it, it seems like this snowball is starting to roll pretty fast down the hill. And I'm not sure there's a way to stop potentially more nuclear tests and God forbid, maybe even the construction and deployment of more nuclear weapons, unless those three countries, the US, Russia, and China, can all somehow get together and strike some kind of new arms control deal. And with that, a huge thanks, Guy. Another great episode this week, and a big thanks to Liz Martin, of course, from AWS, and everyone at the Defense Tech Leadership Summit for making me feel welcome in South Florida this week. And most of all, thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.